Okay, here we are, chapter 3. And I have to tell you that with this pandemic and everything shut down, I haven't been able to go to the barber for a while, as I'm sure that's the same for all of you. So for a while, I was letting my hair grow, and it was getting quite long relative to the past. And then it was just growing disproportionately. Some parts of the hair were growing longer than other parts, so I thought, well, I just need to do something. So then I started cutting it myself, and the more I look in the camera, the more I realize that it just doesn't look good at all. So anyway, my little disclaimer for today: if I look funny, it's because I cut my own hair. Of course, I can't explain the other reasons why I look funny, but anyway, the haircut I'm not proud of. Chapter 3 is a little like chapter 2. A lot of biology. I usually don't focus on the biology. In terms of the biology of sensation, you really only need to know about vision and audition. So the book will cover the ways that the biology of touch, taste, and smell. I'm really not going to require you to know any of that. I want you to know in relationship to audition and vision, where the specific cells are that transduce whatever form of energy we're talking about into the electrochemical signals that our nervous system operates on. The characteristics of those cells, of those transduction agents or transducers, and some theories about how we sense different pitches of sound and how we sense different colors. Those are some of the basic things you're going to need to know about sensation, audition, and vision. The rest of it you don't need to know a whole lot about. Mainly I'm going to talk about some more principles and some basic concepts related to sensation in general and perception in general. First of all, I want to talk about ESP for a little bit. So this is one of those things that's more conceptual. I just want to have you think about whether ESP really exists. So ESP stands for extrasensory perception. It means literally perception without sensation. The question is does that really exist? It could involve things like being able to read somebody's mind, to know what's in their mind, even though you don't have any words from them or any objective evidence as to what's in their mind. You're just sort of perceiving without any sensory input. It could also involve being able to move things with your mind. So I can move that little couch over there simply by wishing it to be so and imagining it moving across the room. Be clairvoyant and see what's happening in somebody's future. All those things could be related to the broad concept of ESP. The question is do people really have those kinds of abilities? I have to tell you, not surprisingly, most scientists, most psychologists would say no. Those abilities, to the extent that we can control them or anybody can control them, do not exist. So the real issue I want to talk about is how are we able to arrive at that conclusion that ESP likely does not exist. So first of all, let's talk about what sensation and perception is in terms of location, order, function, and two elements of process. So first of all, sensation occurs in sense organs. It occurs in your olfactory bulb for smell, the taste buds of your tongue for taste, the skin cells in your skin for touch, and in your retina for vision, and in your cochlea for audition. Perception occurs in the brain. So they occur in two entirely different places. The order of things is that sensation occurs first, perception occurs second. The idea is that in order for you to be able to perceive something, you have to be able to sense something, to put something into your brain. So sensation puts something into your brain, and then your brain can perceive it. So the first thing I want you to think about in relationship to ESP is that it doesn't make any sense based on our understanding of sensation and perception. Now, just because something doesn't make any sense doesn't mean that it's untrue or invalid. It didn't make, for instance, it didn't make any sense to the people around the time of Galileo and Copernicus, most people, that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe and that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than vice versa. But nevertheless, they were wrong. And so it took a little while for people to figure out that what was logical to them at the time wasn't actually true. And Galileo and Copernicus were branded as heretics and incorrect in their thinking, but it turned out they were right. So anyway, down the road, it might be the case that we'll find out that ESP does make sense, that there is some logic to it. But for now, according to what we understand about sensation and perception and the world, ESP just doesn't make any sense. Now, I want to point out something called Occam's razor. Way back in I think the 12th century or so, in the village of Occam in England, there was a man who said something like this, and it's become known as Occam's razor. It goes like this: when there are multiple explanations of the same phenomena, the one that is simplest, the one that requires the fewest assumptions, is most likely the correct one. That has become a scientific tenet. It's become a scientific principle. In order to establish truth, we should first assume that simpler explanations for things, the ones that require fewer explanations, is most likely the correct one. So when things don't make sense, we should doubt them. Now, scientists in general have two things going for them along these lines. One, we have an open mind. Scientists need to have an open mind about things that, all possible explanations for something, but the ones that don't make sense, we should begin to doubt. We should doubt. So that's one reason why we want to be careful about something like ESP. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't fit our normal understanding of things. Now, we'll come back to the most important reason as to why psychologists and scientists don't believe in ESP. But for now, let's just doubt it because it doesn't make sense. Let's go on in this chart here. The function of sensation is really three things. It's to encode the environment, to transduce it, to transduce the energy that's coming from the environment into electrochemical energy, and then send it onto the brain. So remember, in chapter 2, we learned that neurological communication can be called electrochemical communication. That's because there's two processes involved: the electrical part in the axons and the chemical part that occurs between neurons in the synapse. So we're going to call again that energy in the system, in the nervous system that we use to communicate, electrochemical energy. All this light energy, mechanical energy in the form of touch, chemical energy in the form of taste and smell, and sound wave energy, hertz, in the form of audition, needs to be transduced into the kind of energy, the only kind of energy our nervous system understands, and that's electrochemical energy. So largely that's what our sense organs do. They encode that energy form that's out there, change it into electrochemical signals, and then send it on to the brain. The function of perception, on the other hand, is interpretation. So we take that electrochemical energy that has been transduced and now begin to make sense of it in terms of where it likely came from and what it actually means to us. In a sense, it's like the computer that works on binary code, a bunch of zeros and ones, actually. So this mouse, if I press buttons, if I move it around on the table, then that movement gets translated into a bunch of zeros and ones, and that goes to the central processor of the computer. And those zeros and ones are interpreted then to suggest to the computer that it needs to move to a different part of the screen, or it needs to highlight a certain part of the screen, or it needs to move from this link to that one, and so on. In a sense, that's what your brain does, is it interprets the zeros and ones, this raw data that's coming in, and converts them back into lights and sounds and touches and tastes and smells. So we'll call that interpretation. The brain is involved in the process of making sense of these electrochemical signals that are coming in from the sensory organs. Now, the process involved in sensation is quite passive. It just happens. You don't have to will your sense organs to transduce electromagnetic energy or light energy into electrochemical signals. It just does it automatically. That's the way we're made. Perception, on the other hand, is a very active process. Now, it does often happen unconsciously and without our will involved, but in that sense, it's kind of automatic. But at the same time, we definitely have an ability to actively interpret what's coming in a way that can change the way that we perceive it. So two people can get the same raw data coming into their brain from their sensory systems and interpret it two entirely different ways. And sensation is also very objective. What that means is that sensation doesn't change anything. It just converts this other form of energy into electrochemical signals. On the other hand, perception is a very subjective process. As I just indicated, the same sensory input can lead one person to perceive something in terms of what that really is and everything about that, and lead somebody else to perceive it in quite a different way. I guess you could argue, and I would, that perception is really what makes us all different and unique and interesting. It's the thing that's probably most important for psychologists to study. Sensation is studied to help us understand how the process works, leading to perception. But perception is really where the activity is. It's the heart of the matter. Perception is reality, we often say. There's this objective reality that exists out there that is sent into our brains. But the truth is that we perceive it one way, I perceive it one way, you perceive it another way. And the way I perceive it is reality to me. Even if it isn't really reality, it's reality to me, and it's as if it is the real thing. So let's go back to the ESP question. What's the real reason why psychologists don't buy the concept of ESP? Well, it is essentially that there is no reliable evidence that it exists. Now, if you're a scientist, ultimately you want empirical evidence about the things that you are theorizing about. If there's no empirical evidence for something, then you may not be able to say that it doesn't exist. But what you can say is that the evidence suggests it likely doesn't exist. Since we don't have any evidence for it, then it probably does not exist. And because we're operating on Occam's razor, using that principle to guide our truth-seeking behaviors, we're going to be doubtful. And until that evidence comes forth and says that ESP or something like that really does exist, then we're going to doubt it. So some people will say, well, you can't test for the existence of ESP. And I want to just make the point, because I know some of you are thinking this way, that we're not talking about religion or belief in God or an afterlife or anything like that. I would argue and agree that you can't really test for the existence of a God. Now, maybe you can utilize tests of faith, faith-related tests. And for some people, those can be very valid. But that's not the kind of empirical evidence that scientists are looking for. But moving back onto ESP again, back to ESP, you can test for the existence of ESP. if somebody believes that they can read my mind and tell me what color I'm thinking of, I would say, okay, let's test that. We're gonna make it easy on you. There's 10 colors that I'm gonna write down on this piece of paper, and at any given time through the course of this study, this experiment, I'm gonna think about one of those colors, just one of those colors, not any other color that might exist, but just one of these 10. And you're supposed to tell me what color I'm thinking about. So what I'll do is I'll take the color that I'm thinking of. I'll write it down again and again and again repeatedly on a piece of paper for the period of, let's say, 5 minutes. I'll write it down again and again. I'll look at a color swatch of that color visually, repeatedly over this 5 minutes. And I'll repeat it in my mind and actually out loud verbally again and again and again, just to make it certain that color is definitely on my mind and in my sensory and perceptive processes. And while I'm doing that, you're going to be in the next room. You can't see me, you can't hear me, you can't have any other input as to what's going on in that room that I'm in or in my mind, other than your ability to be able to read my mind. And your job will be to pick out of those 10 colors which one I'm thinking of, and writing and repeating verbally again and again. And we'll do it 100 times. And over 100 times, if you can tell me what color I'm thinking of more accurately than 10% of the time, then I'm going to say that you have ESP. I pick out 10% of the time because 10% would be the number of times you should be correct if you're just guessing. But if you can determine what color I'm thinking of, 15 to 20% of the time will say anything greater than 10%, then you're doing it better than chance. So you must have some type of an ability that maybe we can call ESP. So anyway, I think that's a pretty good test of your ability to read my mind. And I want to tell you that kind of test has been done many, many times with that form of ESP and many other types of ESP. And no one has ever been able to consistently show that they have that ability. Now, many people have claimed that they have that ability and have taken advantage of those kinds of tests to try to prove to others they have that ability. In fact, there was a guy named James Randi several years ago, who offered people $1 million. He put it in a bank someplace, and he worked up a contract, and he threw it out there to the public and basically said, look, if you can show us through scientific means that you have ESP, one of these magical abilities, then I'll give you that $1 million. And people tried to collect the $1 million, but no one ever was able to do that. And there's been many other, that's kind of like a gimmicky sort of thing that James Randi has done, but there's many scientific studies that have attempted to show that people have these abilities or don't, and what they have shown is that they don't. So in the absence of evidence that suggests that there's something going on there, any reliable evidence that suggests there's something going on there, then we're going to say that it likely does not exist. And remember, it doesn't make any sense to begin with, so it likely does not exist. All right, let's go on and talk about some of the basic laws of sensation. One basic law of sensation is called sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is the basic idea that our senses adapt to environmental stimuli that are constant, that are unchanging. So the idea is that our sense organs kind of stop sending information to the brain about something that our sense organs are sending repeatedly again and again and again, moment to moment to moment. For instance, if somebody burns the toast in the house and you got this pungent, strong burnt toast smell in the house for several minutes, once that's happened, if somebody then walks in the house who wasn't there when the toast was burnt, that person's likely going to go, wow, who burnt the toast? And it's very commonly the case that the people who were there when the toast was burnt are going, you can smell that? I can't smell it anymore. I smelled it before, but I don't anymore. So it must still be there, but I'm not smelling it anymore. My sensory systems have adapted to it. So basically what happens there is the sense organ and the brain have this deal. It is that the sense organ doesn't want to wear out the brain by sending redundant, irrelevant information that's just not needed. It doesn't want to keep saying, I smell the toast, I smell the toast, I smell the toast. And the brain doesn't want to be inundated with useless information. And so it basically is okay with that deal and says, okay, when you stop sending rapid impulses about this burnt toast smell, that's okay. It's kind of like the guy that got married on the day that he got married. He said to his wife, you know what, I love you, but I really shouldn't have to tell you that every day for the rest of my life. You don't need to hear that all the time, and I don't need to have to tell you that all the time. So I'll tell you now, I love you. And if that ever changes, I'll let you know. So that probably doesn't work so well in a relationship between two people with emotions and feelings that could get hurt. But it does kind of work with the brain and the sensory system. The deal is, I'll tell you, the sensory system will tell us when things change. It'll tell us about new things, but it shouldn't have to keep telling us again and again about things that are the same. So when we smell the burnt toast initially, and it's a new thing, then our nose sends these impulses to our brain rapidly again and again and again. This is burnt toast, this is burnt toast. And then after a while, when it's the same thing, then it slows down its impulses, and the brain is supposed to realize that it's still there. It's supposed to react to the previously sent burst of information and realize the burnt toast smell is there. But after a while, it can get kind of fooled into thinking it's not there because there's no major input. So those people who were in the house when the burnt toast occurs, after 15 minutes, they don't smell it anymore because of the sensory systems slowing down their impulses. But for the new person coming in the house, it's a new stimulus, and so they smell it. All right, we know that happens with smell. We know it happens with taste, and it happens with touches. It's a good thing that it happens in terms of touches. If you think about it, I don't want to have to keep feeling that I have this ring on my finger. I don't want to have to pay attention to that. And so if the sense organ is constantly telling me there's a ring on your finger, there's a ring on your finger, there's a watch on your wrist, that's going to use up resources and energy that is better used on something else. So the fact that the sense organs are going to slow down their impulses about the ring and the wristwatch, and I may actually forget that it's there, is actually a good thing. But if I move the ringer, if I move my wristwatch, then I'm going to be able to sense it now, because now it's a changed stimulus. Also, when you're in a hot tub and you eased into it because it was pretty warm and you could feel how, that it was kind of uncomfortably warm, but then you ease into it and you sit there for several minutes. After a while, you don't feel like it's so warm anymore. It's a little more tolerable. And then you move. If you start moving, then you can begin to feel that it's pretty hot again. That's because now it's a changed stimulus, and the sense organ is going, wow, this is new, so I'm going to send rapid information to the brain to tell the brain that it's hot. So it happens in the case of sounds, touch, taste, smell. Let's take a look at vision. Now, I can't really walk you through this with you in the classroom. It might be easier there, but I'd like you to focus on an object in the room. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on that picture with one eye closed, and I'm going to hold it closed with my right hand, and I'm going to take my finger and put it against my left eyeball and push it against my nose so that I'm holding that eyeball completely still. If I hold my eyeball completely still and just look at it for several seconds with that eyeball completely still, what happens is that within that amount of time, everything blanks out, everything becomes black, and I'm not seeing anything. The reason why I'm not seeing anything is because it's now become a truly unchanging stimulus, and the sense organ's going, I don't want to have to keep sending to the brain the same thing again and again, and the brain doesn't want to be inundated with that useless, redundant information. And the possibility is that the brain will not perceive anything because it's going to ignore the little impulses that are coming in and just assume that it's not there anymore. The building that I was looking at is not there. The reason why we don't notice sensory adaptation with vision in our everyday life is because we never really have an instance where something is truly unchanging. The fact is their eyes are constantly moving. Because they're constantly moving, then the same cells that are doing the job of transduction in the retina are not ever going to tire out. And it's as if they're able to pass the baton of transduction from one set of rods and cones in the retina to another set, and then they do their job for a moment until the eyes shift their gaze a little bit, again because of this muscular movement here, and then they pass the baton to another set of rods and cones, and so none of them ever really tire out. The only way you can really experience sensory adaptation with vision is to make sure that your eyeballs are completely still so that they're not really allowed to move at all, so that it's going to be the same job, the same rods and cones that are doing the job of transduction from moment to moment to moment. All right. The fact is that sensory adaptation leads to something really important that I've already alluded to, and that is that our senses detect change best. It's most important that we're able to see movement, new things, the dynamic actions that are happening in the world. If I'm out on the golf course, it's important that I see the golf balls, but the ones that are most important to see are the ones that are moving. When you go out in the hallway, if we ever meet face-to-face in classrooms again, if you go out in the hallway between classes, or actually in the middle of a class, and you don't want to disrupt the classes that are in session by being loud or anything like that, but you happen to see down the hallway somebody whose attention you want to get, and that person's looking in your direction but not really seeing you and not reacting like they know that you're there. If you want them to get their attention, you can't yell because that could disturb the class that you just left and other classes that are in session down the hallway. But you want that person to see you, so what you do is you move, you wave at them, and you make yourself a changing stimulus so that person has a better ability to see you. That's because you implicitly and unconsciously know that we detect change best. But I want to point out that the reason why we detect change best is because our senses adapt to things that are the same. There was a study, a little demonstration of this done with frogs years ago that I first learned about probably when I was in grad school, and that was that they put these frogs in a terrarium with a bunch of fly food that they could eat. But what the researchers then did is they introduced a gas into the terrarium, and this gas paralyzed the flies. The flies were alive, and they could still be eaten, and supposedly they could still be seen by the frog. But because they weren't moving, these frogs would literally die of starvation, even though they had all this food around them, because they didn't see the flies. Now, when the gas wore off, what they found was that the flies started moving around, and then instantly the frogs could see the flies because they're moving around, and the frog would reach out and eat them. Humans are no different. We detect change best because of the principle of sensory adaptation. Now, another question that I want to talk about in relationship to sensation is the idea of subliminal messages. Now, subliminal messages have received a lot of attention. The question I want to discuss is, do subliminal messages have a powerful influence on us when we're exposed to them? Now, first of all, I want to make sure you understand what a subliminal message is. Something is subliminal when it's outside of the normal thresholds. We call that the absolute threshold for sensation and perception. When something is outside of the normal thresholds for sensation and perception, but we sense it anyway, and it has an effect on our behavior, then we call that subliminal persuasion. So subliminal message is not just a subtle message that might occur in certain types of advertising. It's not being able to see or hear something if you strain and look at it and think about it carefully. It's something that is just outside of the normal thresholds for sensation and perception to occur. Now, this is based on the principle of sensory reduction. Sensory reduction basically is similar to sensory adaptation in that it's a principle that makes sure that our sensory systems aren't wearing themselves out by sending to the brain useless information. And it also ensures that the brain isn't going to be forced to deal with a bunch of information that is not needed, because we only need to deal with certain types of information in order to be able to survive. Those are the most important types of information. The rest of it we can do without. So there are these absolute thresholds for hearing, touch, taste, smell, and vision, within which we can sense and perceive, but outside of which we can't, because we don't need that information. And to be inundated with that is to wear out our sensory systems and to wear out our brain. And so we have a visual spectrum, an auditory spectrum, a touch spectrum, a smell and taste spectrum, and everything outside of those thresholds is subliminal. This is subliminal out here. This is inside the visual spectrum, the auditory spectrum, and so we would call that the visible or the auditory spectrum. Now let's take a look at it. Actually, let me further say that the fact of sensory reduction suggests that subliminal perception is a possibility. If sensory reduction as a principle didn't exist, if our sensory systems and brain didn't do that, then there would be no thresholds and everything would be available to be sensed and perceived by the brain. But since there are thresholds, the possibility exists that something that's out here that shouldn't normally be sensed could still be perceived. And if it does get perceived, then we would call that subliminal perception. So, you can't see this too well, but what this shows is the range of light energy, electromagnetic energy that exists out there in the environment. You have slow light energy waves and increasing to very fast light wave energy. The visible spectrum exists right in here, and it's blown up down here. So this is where we see all the colors of the rainbow: Roy G. Biv, Roy orange, yellow, blue, green, indigo, violet. And everything above this line to the right side that's too fast is subliminal. It exists. It involves ultraviolet waves, X-rays, gamma rays. They exist, but we don't see them because they're subliminal. We don't need those. And then down on the other end, everything that's below this line that's slow enough so that it's outside of this threshold on this side, and it includes infrared rays, radar, FM, TV, radio, and AC circuitry, light energy. Those are subliminal. Now, another way that we can experience subliminal visual energy is by having something shown to us so fleetingly, so quickly, that it's not there long enough for us to be able to sense it long enough to pass it on to the brain. So examples of this would be something in a Disney movie or something like that, where a frame is presented so quickly that we don't consciously perceive it, and so it doesn't really get sent on to the brain to be perceived. In the Lion King movie, Simba throws himself down in the dust, and the dust particles go up in the air and then they fall to the ground. And for a fleeting instance, those particles are supposedly arranged in such a way, if you look at them the right way and have the right kind of imagination, that they spell out the words SEX or FX, depending upon what you want to believe. And the only way you can really see it is and see the letters and read them is if you slow down the video, and then you're able to see it long enough so that your sense organ can pay attention to it and send it on to the brain. Supposedly what happened there is that somebody did that and other things in Disney movies in order to either sabotage Disney, or the possibility exists that the sound company that was involved in the sound in the film did that as an subliminal advertising technique to put their initials out there, or the name of their company out there in this subliminal message. Who knows what really the truth is there, but a lot of people have noted that when you slow down that part of the video, you can see something in those dust particles, but you can't see it when it's normal speed, and so therefore it is a subliminal message. Now let's take a look at audition. Again, hard to see on the screen, but what this shows is how the elephant, the human, the dog, the cat, the mouse, the whale, porpoise, bat, and moth have different auditory spectrums in terms of pitches. So the elephant and the human and the dog and the cat have quite large auditory spectrums, and they extend, particularly the elephant and the human, they extend pretty much to the low pitch end of the spectrum. But there's a lot of high pitches that exist out here that the elephant can't hear. Some high pitches that the human can hear that the elephant can't. And then the dog has a similar auditory spectrum as the human, but there are some high pitches that the dog can hear that we can't. So that's the reason why dog whistles that are very high pitched work. They can hear them, but we can't. So for us, they're subliminal. For the dog, they're not. All these other species down here, they have a better ability to hear things on the higher end of the scale than we do. Everything for the moth here has a very small auditory spectrum. All of these low pitches out here are subliminal. All of these high pitches out here are subliminal. Now they exist, but they're just not sensed and sent onto the brain and perceived. So that's the definition of subliminal message, subliminal persuasion. Something that's outside of the normal threshold for seeing and perceiving, or sensing and perceiving. Now, I want to point out that even though in some ways it doesn't make sense that we should be able to sense and perceive something that's outside of the normal thresholds for any kind of sensation, there is a difference between subliminal perception and subliminal persuasion, subliminal learning. Subliminal perception, I'm going to say, is the mere perception of a subliminal stimulus, something that's outside of the threshold. If it is merely perceived and doesn't really change behavior, we're going to call that subliminal perception. And it turns out that the research shows, the empirical evidence shows that that actually can occur. So with this, what they do is they'll show people a screen like this, and they're looking at this screen for several minutes. And even though they can't consciously perceive anything, there are subliminal images that are shown repeatedly again and again on the screen. And the subjects are asked, did you see anything on the screen? No, I didn't see anything. It was just a blank screen. But say every 5 seconds, there was a very quick image of a geometric shape, like a triangle right here. There was a triangle again and again and again over the course of, say, a half hour. And then the researchers will say, okay, now look at this screen, and you'll see a circle, a rectangle, a square, and a triangle. Now tell us which one of those you like the most, or rate each one on a scale of likability, which one you feel most comfortable with the most. And it turns out that the person who subliminally saw the triangle is most likely going to like that one the most. Is going to say, I like that one the most. Give that the highest rating. This research shows that when you are subliminally presented geometric shapes, even though you don't know that you've seen them, it can change your mood and the likability and familiarity with that thing. That effect tends to be very fleeting, very weak, but it does exist. They've also shown that when you look at a blank screen and you're subliminally shown a smiling face, you don't know that you've seen the smiling face, but it's been shown there very quickly. And then you're asked to rate a comic or rate a picture in terms of how much you like it. The research says that after seeing subliminally the smiling face, you're more likely to like that comic strip, to rate the comic strip more favorably than if you didn't see the smiley face. If you see a frowning face subliminally and you don't know that you've seen it, it will also likewise in a very small, fleeting, short, temporary sort of way, it can influence you to dislike something else that you've been asked to rate, as long as the two are shown pretty close in contiguity with each other. So in that sense, subliminal perception is real. But the question is can it really change your behavior? Now, it can change your mood for a few seconds after exposure. Not in major ways, but in kind of small ways. But does it actually cause you to buy a product that you otherwise wouldn't buy, to spend more money than you would actually spend? Can it actually change your behavior in a way that has some tangible effect on you? The research would say no. So we're going to call that subliminal learning. Now, I want to point out that there was a guy named James Vicari way back in the 1950s or 60s, maybe late 50s, I can't remember for certain, who claimed that he put in a movie that he was showing in a theater the words in a frame in the movie, eat popcorn, drink Coca-Cola. He put that frame in the movie so that it would pop up every 5 seconds. It was just one frame at a time, and it was presented obviously so fast that the people in the audience didn't know that it was there. Nobody reported seeing that in the movie, but he then reported that when that frame came up every 5 seconds, it increased sales of popcorn in the lobby and Coca-Cola anywhere from like a third to 50%. So this created a huge interest and clamor saying, wow, we don't like this sort of thing. This shows that advertisers can change our behavior by subliminally presenting things like that. And so we need to do something to stop this. And so that led to the government getting involved and saying it's not legal to use subliminal advertising. It created a whole bunch of, in fact, it led to today, me talking to you about subliminal persuasion. But I just want to point out that since then, it's been shown, actually, James Vicari admitted long after all the furor that his statement about what he did in the movie, he admitted that he had lied, that he didn't actually do what he said he did. He didn't have that data. And the fact is that he didn't have anything to suggest that subliminal perception and persuasion is real. And so the whole impetus for all the emphasis on subliminal perception research that has been conducted all the years since, it was based on a lie, based on bogus information. Now, since then, since he admitted that he lied about it and it was all bogus, there's been other research. And here again, we need to look at what does the evidence say. If the evidence says that subliminal perception and persuasion can occur, subliminal learning can occur, then we'll change our tune and we'll say that it's real and it's a powerful effect. But if it says that it likely does not occur, then since it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, we're going to doubt it. So the research goes like this, a classic study. And it's based on the fact that a big application of subliminal learning today is in auditory self-help messages within music or ocean sounds or instrumental sounds that are peaceful and relaxing. So you buy these things. You buy these CDs back in the day, or you buy MP3 files or something like that. And consciously what you hear when you listen to them is something that's relaxing or peaceful. But the reason why you buy them is because supposedly on the label and the advertisement for this product, it suggests that there are subliminal messages there, high-pitched voices that you don't consciously hear because they're outside of the auditory spectrum for humans. But the voices are saying things like, I'm never going to smoke again. I have extreme willpower and strength, and smoking is disgusting. I'm going to quit. I don't desire smoking at all. So people who can't quit smoking otherwise, they've tried everything else and it's not working, but they want to quit. They buy these things hoping that they'll be able to quit smoking. And people buy these subliminal self-help CDs or messages, auditory files to get rid of warts, relieve constipation, to improve their memories, improve their self-esteem, become better skilled at whatever athletic endeavor they're engaging in. There is really no limit to the types of things that people have used these subliminal messages for in their lives to improve their lives. So what they have done is they'll take a group of subjects and they'll present them with two options. They can either choose for a few weeks to listen to the nice music and the pleasant sounds with the auditory self-help messages that are designed to improve memory, or they can choose the ones that have the messages designed to improve self-esteem. So subjects make their choices, they go home, they listen to these things, and then they come back and then they report to the researchers what they perceive were the outcomes of listening to these messages. And what the researchers find is that these subjects come back believing that if they chose the self-esteem self-help messages, that their self-esteem had increased, that they were much better off than they were before. And if they chose the memory messages, that their memories were better off. And people tend to actually cite evidence in their lives. Yeah, people tell me that I'm more positive, or that my grades have actually come up in school, and I think I'm doing better on these tests. So people really believe these things work. And then the researchers said, well, that's really interesting. You believe these messages really worked for you, but we have to tell you that we changed the labels on these auditory files. So when you thought, and we told you that you were going to be getting messages designed to enhance your self-esteem, you were actually getting messages designed to enhance your memory, and vice versa. So the fact that you believe, and you actually have some evidence in your mind that these things worked, it was all placebo effect. Basically, it was because you believed it. Scientists have this statement that goes like this: I'll see it when I believe it. Now, we lay people tend to think about this version of that. I'll believe it when I see it. But what research has shown to actually be true is the opposite. I'll see it when I believe it. When I believe something is true, it's more likely for me to become a reality, and I'm more likely to actually see it or sense it. And I think the same is going on here. Now, the placebo effect is real. It's a mind over matter sort of a thing. And it can be useful. But you have to realize here what this suggests is that the active ingredient in these subliminal messages is not the thing that's creating the change in self-esteem or memory. It's your belief that it works. So there really is no, based on that kind of research evidence, there really is no reliable evidence that suggests that people's behavior can be changed in significant ways through subliminal messaging. So you don't need to worry about it, and the legal system, governments don't need to, the court system doesn't need to pass all these laws prohibiting subliminal messages, because they're not powerful ways to change people's behavior. All right, let's take a look at vision. Can't see it on the screen, but what this shows is the eyeball. All this surface in the back of the eyeball we call the retina. And that's where transduction occurs in the eye. The very center of the back of the retina is called the fovea. So the fovea is where we have cones only. Cones and rods are disproportionately dispersed across the back of the retina. They are most numerous in the center of the back of the retina, and they become less numerous as you go forward toward the front of the eye. Rods, on the other hand, are most numerous in the periphery of the retina out here, way out here, and least numerous as you get closer to the center of the back of the retina. And in fact, they don't exist at all in the fovea. Now, cones allow us to see in bright light, rich color and detail. In fact, cones are not as sensitive to light as rods are, and so they need a lot of light to operate. But they allow us to see the richness and the fine detail and the color of everything we're wanting to see. So if there's a lot of light to see something in, we want to look directly at it so that we can focus it on the center of the back of our retina where the cones are most plentiful. However, if something is being viewed in dim light, if we look straight at it, we're going to focus it on the center of our retina where there's cones only, and we're not going to be able to see it very well. In order to see something in dim light, you need to see it with your rods. And so rather than look straight at it, you want to look to the side so that it's focused on toward the side of your retina where you have all these rods, and they're going to be better able to sense what you're trying to see. So rods allow us to see in dim light. They allow us to see form and shape and lines and contours and contrast, but they don't allow us to see color and fine detail. What this picture shows when you look at it on the PowerPoint is that light goes through a bunch of other cells in the back of your retina before the light gets to the rods and cones. Light has to go through ganglion cells, bipolar cells, horizontal cells, and then to the rods and the cones. And transduction occurs in the rods and cones, and then information from the rods and the cones is then transferred through the bipolar, the ganglion, and the horizontal cells on the way to the brain. And that information, as it's going through these other cells, it actually gets paired up, and it's actually being organized in a way that will allow the brain to better be able to perceive different elements of that light. So there's some integration and organization of information going on even before the information gets to the brain. Now, one of the things that you're going to need to know for a quiz or the test is how we perceive different colors. One theory is the trichromatic theory. It says that we have three different types of cones. We have red cones, green cones, and blue cones. And all the colors that we're able to see come from a combination of the degrees of stimulation that are occurring in the red, green, and the blue cones. That's called the trichromatic theory, and it is correct. Another theory says that the information, as it is sent from our cones to these other cells on the way to the brain, it's being organized into different types of light, different types of information. And that's the reason why color blindness tends to be red for red-green colors. The most common type of color blindness is red-green. So red and green must be paired up. Red light and green light must be paired up in the same cells on the way to the brain. Likewise, the second most common type of color blindness is for blue and yellow. So blue and yellow must then be paired up and be going through the same cells on the way to the brain. And so something is wrong with those cells that are handling blue and yellow light. if you have red-green color blindness, something must be wrong with those cells that handle red and green light. So that's called the opponent process theory of color perception, and it's accurate as well. So they both explain color perception, one at the level of the cones, that's the trichromatic theory, and the other at the level of the bipolar, horizontal, and ganglion cells on the way to the brain. Another thing that's interesting is that when you look at an image, a color light, and then you look at a white screen or white piece of paper, there will be an after image of what you just saw. And the after image of red is green and vice versa. The after image of blue is yellow and vice versa. Again, suggesting that there are these color pairs, red and green and blue and yellow. And that's operating at the level of these ganglion, bipolar, and horizontal cells from the cones on the way to the brain. Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the ear, but let's just, in the form of a quiz here, if the retina in the eye is where transduction occurs, then where does transduction occur in the ear? Well, the answer to this is going to be number 4, the cochlea. Vestibular canals is where we handle balance and equilibrium and body orientation. The thalamus is not where transduction occurs in the ear because it's not even in the ear. The basilar membrane is a part of the cochlea, but most analogous to the retina is actually the cochlea itself. So the cochlea is where transduction occurs in the ear. Rods and cones are where transduction occurs specifically in the retina. What's the analogous portion of the cochlea that is similar to rods and cones? It is the hair cells on the basilar membrane of the cochlea. So Pacini and corpuscles allow us to sense touch. They're in the skin. The incus malleus and stapes are the bones of the middle ear. They amplify the sound waves as they come in. Vestibular canals are the part, again, above the ear that allows us to understand body orientation and movement and so on. But it's the hair cells in the cochlea where transduction of sounds actually occurs. So what happens is sound waves come in, they vibrate the eardrum. The eardrum then vibrates the bones of the middle ear, and the bones in the middle ear vibrate the round window of the cochlea, and that vibrates the fluid that's in the cochlea. And then on this basilar membrane in the cochlea, you got these hair cells that are protruding, and they get vibrated based on those sound waves, and transduction occurs there. And when those electrical chemical signals are sent from the hair cells of the cochlea to the brain, then we have audition. Now again, you need to know about theories of how we sense different pitches in this case. So there's several theories. Frequency theory says that the same degree of vibration or amount of vibration that's coming in to the eardrum is going to be passed on through the bones of the middle ear, through the round window of the cochlea, and to the basilar membrane and the hair cells. And then electrical signals or electrochemical signals are going to be sent to the brain at the same frequency as the sound wave that came in. And so if it's a high-pitched sound wave, then it's going to vibrate the hair cells at a higher rate, and signals are going to be sent at a higher rate, and therefore your brain will know that it's a higher pitch. The problem with frequency theory is that the hair cells can only send impulses so fast. They can't send impulses 10,000 times a second, which might be the rate of the sound wave that's coming in. And so it doesn't really explain really high-pitched sounds. And so in order to explain really high-pitched sounds, you have to look at some other theories like place theory. Place theory says that where the stimulation of where the electrochemical signals are sent from in the cochlea determines pitch to a certain extent. And it turns out that if the amount of vibration of a sound wave coming in is most commonly happening at the front part of the cochlea, then it's going to be transduced or experienced in the brain as a higher pitch. If the maximum amount of vibration in the hair cells of the cochlea is happening further on down the cochlea, then it's going to be a lower pitch. So the place in the cochlea where the vibration and transduction is happening is going to determine pitch to a certain extent. There's also another theory called volley theory that allows us to hear higher pitches as well, and I'll let you just study that further in the book on your own. I'm most likely going to ask you about place theory or frequency theory. All right, now perception. Let's move to that part of the chapter. Perception is the mere or the active subjective interpretation of information that's come in via the sensory systems. Let's take a look at that in the form of this comic. So this palm reader is reading the palm of this guy, and what she says to him is that you are fair, compassionate, and intelligent. So she is sensing and perceiving the truth about him, that he's a good guy, fair, compassionate, and intelligent. But she's also perceiving through the palm reading here that he's perceived by others as being biased, callous, and dumb. In fact, she knows that she's perceived by others to be the exact opposite of the way that he really is. And again, I talked about how perception can be reality for us. I just want to point out that how important that is. It doesn't really matter if he really is fair, compassionate, and intelligent. If he's perceived by others as the opposite of that, biased, callous, and dumb, he's not going to get the jobs. He's not going to get the dates. His life is going to be terribly influenced by the fact that he's perceived in a way that is opposite of the way that he really is. And so the only thing that really matters is how he's perceived. That's what we mean when we say that perception is reality. It's not really reality, but it's the only thing that matters. You'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit in the discussion board post for this chapter. Now, take a look at this. In terms of sensation, you're all, when you look at this, sensing the same thing. Black and white splotches that are being transduced, being sent to your brain, and your brain is going through this active subjective process to try to make sense of them, to see things. Well, maybe you see what I see right in the middle here. There's a dog. This is the top of his head. This is the dog's right ear. This is the dog's mouth. He's sniffing in the ground. This is his right shoulder, 2 front legs, and his belly. And then he just kind of disappears off here into the shadows. That's perception. If you're able to perceive the dog, it's because you're organizing those black and white splotches in a way that kind of makes sense to you. Not everybody's able to perceive the dog, but it is there for most people. The fact that not everybody sees it and other people see other things suggests again that perception is a very variable, subjective process. Now, take a look at this. See if you can figure out what this is. Now, perceptual processes do involve, as I said, a certain amount of will and desire and motivation. And you sort through your experiences and you try to figure out what experience and other things you've seen may relate to this. And so you're trying to figure this out. But I made it particularly hard because it's too easy when you look at it initially right side up. It's actually upside down. So if you look at it right side up, a lot of people will say it's a man on a horse. I always like to point out, though, if you say that that's a man on a horse, that's likely because you've been influenced by the sexist world that you live in. The fact is that many people see that that's a man on a horse, even though there's nearly nothing here to suggest that that's a man. It's a person on a horse. It could be a man or a woman. But we have this tendency to perceive that as a man because of the world that we live in. Now remember, we talked about projective tests in chapter 11. Projective tests are those tests used by Freudian psychologists to get underneath the surface of the water and get into people's unconscious psyches to understand their mental issues and their personalities. We project onto things that are true of our internal unconscious being, according to Freud. So likewise here, if you see the man on the horse, it's a projective test that suggests that you're sexist to a certain extent, and you can't really live in this world and not be sexist to a certain extent because of the way that we're all raised and the things that we're exposed to. Now that's changing, just not changing as rapidly as it should. And the same thing is true with many other isms and other kinds of ways of perceiving the world that we have. They're a product of our environment, and they cause us to perceive the world in certain ways, even when we kind of don't want to. We just kind of do, and it becomes kind of a trap for us. Now, when you look at this, many people say this is Jesus. Now, if you're having a hard time seeing it, realize that right here is a face. He's looking straight at you. This is the shoulders of that person. This is an eye. This is an eye. So this would be the right eye. This is the left eye. Nose, chin. The light is basically coming from this direction. And then over here we got shadows. Then we got long hair, mustache, beard. And so some people say that looks like Jesus. But my guess is that if you were a Hindu, Indian, living in India, hadn't really been exposed to Christianity, that you probably wouldn't say that that was Jesus. Again, suggesting that the way that we perceive things is largely based on our environmental experiences. Some people say that this is Charles Manson, George Harrison of the Beatles. Some people say it's the Zigzag Man. But again, maybe what you see there is a function of the world that you live in and what you've been exposed to. The person who sees the Zigzag Man is likely somebody, according to projective theory, the person who sees the Zigzag Man is likely different in fundamental ways from the person who sees Jesus Christ. The Zigzag Man, by the way, is the logo for the alternative rolling paper, the rolling paper for alternative cigarettes that you buy in the local whatever drug paraphernalia store. What do you see here? Well, if you look carefully enough, and the first time I saw this, I had a hard time. I could not see what what's supposed to be seen here for the life of me for the longest time. But now when I look at it, I can't see but one thing, and that is the cow. So this is the cow's head right here, and this is his body. This is his right ear, right eye, left eye, and nostrils, and the bridge of his nose. When I first looked at it and I couldn't see the cow, it was largely because I was trying to make sense of this detail down here. I thought that was important to pay attention to, and I was trying to make something of that. But the fact is that's background. This is background. This is what we call figure. This is figure. This is ground. And an important way of perceiving anything is to appropriately, accurately figure out what's figure and what's background. The figure is what's most important, and you focus on that. Background, you shove in the background, and you don't pay a whole lot of attention to it, because if you try to focus too much on that, it's going to cause you to misperceive things. So what this illustrates is the importance of seeing the difference between the figure and the background and accurately noting what's his figure and what's background. Now, when you look at this is kind of different in that what's figure here at first would be the black vases. But if you look at it more carefully and shift your focus a little bit, what you see is white faces. So what this shows is that sometimes you have the ability to shift your focus and change figure to background and vice versa, and you can see multiple things, different things that kind of give you a richer view of things. But I just want to point out that this mostly is not the way life is. In real life, if you misconstrue figure and background, you're likely going to be messed up. It's a little bit like studying for a test in school and studying it really well so that you know all that stuff that you studied well, so that you're pretty confident going in on the test. And then when you take the test, you realize that what's on the test is actually quite a bit different from what you actually studied. So you don't do well on the test. The fact is that you studied background. And if you studied background and no matter how well you knew it, you're likely not going to do well on the test when the teacher had an idea that the figure was somehow different from what you thought was figure, and so tested you on different things. So messing up figure and ground in an academic setting usually leads to poor grades. I would argue that the very best students have a knack for determining what's figure and what's background, and they spend a lot less time trying to figure it out and spend a lot less time studying background, and therefore do better on the test more readily and easily, just because they have a better knack for doing the basic differentiation between figure and ground. Now, the more you get to know something, the more experience you have with something, the better ability you have to differentiate between figure and ground. But some people have a natural ability to do that with certain things that's better than other people, and those are the ones that tend to excel earlier on and do better, at least earlier on, than other people. Here's another interesting example. This is a vase that was commissioned for the Queen of England for her silver jubilee on the throne, or silver anniversary on the throne. So this is the Queen of England. This is her husband, Prince Philip. Again, true life is not really like this. Mostly messing up figure and ground doesn't lead to seeing faces and vases. It just messes you up. So Gestalt psychologists have come up with several principles that describe the basic rules that we use to perceive the world. The first one is figure ground. It is the one that is most innate in us. We don't have to be taught to figure out what's figure and what's background. It just automatically happens with humans. Human infants just automatically seem to be able quickly figure out what's figure and ground. Now, these other pictures, you can't really see that well, but these pictures are designed to illustrate other Gestalt principles of perception. This is called the principle of proximity. It basically says that when you see this, a line, another line, another line, another line, another line, and there's this space in between these two lines that doesn't exist here. The spaces are smaller here and here and here than here and here. The principle of proximity says that we're likely to see this as three groups of two lines, not 6 lines, but 3 groups of 2, because we tend to want to group things together that are closer to each other in physical or temporal proximity. This picture here shows triangles, circles, and triangles, and the principle of similarity says that we're most likely to see this or organize this in our mind in terms of columns of similar items. So a column of triangles and a column of circles and a column of triangles. This principle of similarity suggests that one of the reasons for racism and sexism is that we have a natural tendency to group people in our minds according to the way that they look. If people on the outside look similar to each other, we're going to group them together and say that somehow they belong together. And these people over here look different from them, so they belong together, and they belong in a separate group than these people. So we'll naturally look for the differences between these people as a way of understanding these people. So that's one of the reasons why we automatically think of males and females being different, and blacks and whites, and Asians and Hispanics as being different. This sort of suggests, pessimistically, as some psychologists and scientists believe, racism and sexism and those kinds of isms, lookism, weightism, ageism, will always exist as long as it's readily apparent when we look at these people in different groups that they're somehow different. If we all intermarried and somehow lived in a world where everybody kind of looked the same, then many of these isms would not occur, because we would have a hard time automatically putting people in these different categories based on differences in appearance. Now, likely, because of the way the human mind works, emotions and self-esteem and self-preservation, we would find other differences to make a deal about, and there would be other kinds of isms, but many of the isms that are based on different appearances would tend to go away if the differences in appearance went away as well. Anyway, similarity, I would argue, is a strong basis, natural basis for many stereotypes and prejudices. Now, here you see a snail shell, not because you see everything, but because you're putting closure on it, filling in the gaps. So closure is filling in the gaps to make sense of something. An example of this would be you see a little news blurb, the headline, and you're not reading the whole article, you're not getting all the details, but seeing that headline, reading just the headline, gives you the opportunity to interpret it a certain way. So you put closure on it in a way that involves your motivation, your past experiences, your desires, and your biases. You put closure on it and arrive at a different conclusion than somebody else who reads the same headline. So we all put closure and fill in the gaps on things and come up with different conclusions than other people, simply because of our backgrounds and our biases and motivations. Likewise, closure can also explain how we can see a neon sign at night going down the street for something that we're somewhat familiar with. We can see the neon sign, and maybe some of the letters are burnt out, so the lights are not working right, so the letters are not complete, the word's not complete, but we can still read it because of closure. And then there's the example on the internet where you look at a paragraph. It's got a few sentences in it, separated by periods. And if you look at it carefully, you realize that everything is all jumbled up. But if you don't look at it all that carefully and try to read it, you find out that you can actually read it, and everybody pretty much reads it the same way. But again, when you look at it carefully, you realize that really only the first two letters and the last letter, I think, of every word are in their proper places, but all the other letters are scrambled up. We're able to put closure on that and fill in the gaps and make sense of it, even if all the other letters are scrambled up, because of our understanding of the English language and because of our understanding of the words that are used in those sentences. Now, this is the principle of good continuation or continuity. You look at this and it shows a straight line and a wavy line. The principle of continuity would cause you to say that this is exactly, as I just said, two things. It's made up of two things, a straight line and a wavy line. Now, you could also perceive that as this, a straight line and a wavy line as depicted by this, a straight line and a wavy line. You could also see this image as this, straight, half circle, straight, half circle, straight, half circle. And then down here, half circle, straight, half circle, straight, half circle, straight. This, if you push these two images together, it's the same as that. And so this is an alternative way to perceive that original stimulus. But most of us would not perceive that original stimulus in this way because it just doesn't simplify the world that much, and it doesn't exemplify the principle of we like to see things as being continuous, a straight continuous line and a wavy continuous line. So, basic perceptual grouping principles that we've covered are figure ground, proximity, similarity, closure, and continuity, or good continuation. Now, I want to have you focus on something else here, the interplay between size and distance. Now, if you look at these two men here in this hallway here, do you see anything funny here? Well, first of all, I'm not having you dig deep and try to find something that's not there. I think there's not really anything funny here. It's just two men sitting in likely the same type of chair, and they're roughly the same size. This man might be a little taller than that one, but probably not a whole lot of difference in size and height. This man just happens to be further down the hallway, maybe 10, 15 feet between them. But the fact is that even though we don't really see anything funny here, that's because our brain has sort of fixed it. Our eyes are actually telling us that this guy here is very small relative to this guy here. In fact, if you take this pad of paper here, this guy is roughly this tall, whereas this guy back here is less than half that size. He's that tall. And so if you bring him down here, you see that he actually looks very small relative to this guy. That's what our eyes are telling our brain, but our brain is fixing it in order to make sense of it. Our brain is aware of the principle that as objects go away from our eyes, they tend to get smaller. And so we automatically fix it to understand that that guy down the hallway is likely the same size as this guy here. And so we perceive him as being quite a bit bigger than our eyes are actually telling us. Now, when you look at this, it's a similar concept in the form of an illusion. These three cones, they're all the same size, but this one back here looks like it's further away. The one that looks like it's further away is going to be perceived as bigger than the one that's closer, because normally things, when they're further away, get smaller to us. And since it's the same size as this one here, then it must actually be bigger than this one here. When I look at this thumbtack that's on this bulletin board over here, my finger, my little fingernail, and that thumbtack, actually that's not going to work, is it? There's a picture of my granddaughter here. So her body is about the size of my fingernail. And I'm thinking, my eyes are telling me that, but my brain's is saying that, but that's further away. So that picture of my granddaughter is likely a lot bigger than my fingernail. We're constantly doing that as we go through life. But the problem is that that can lead to illusions such as this. This one that looks to be the same size to our eye as this one here is also further away, so it must actually be bigger, even though it's not. This monster here looks like it's further away than this one here. Our eyes are telling our brain that they're the same size, but our eyes are also telling the brain that this one's further away. So therefore, since it's the same size and further away, it must actually be quite a bit bigger, because normally things get smaller the further away they go, right? So if you take away the distance cues that say that this monster is further away, then this monster looks to be the same size as this one. But if you put those distance cues back again, then now this monster looks bigger again. So what I'm saying here is this monster looks like he's bigger because he looks like he's further away. Now that's the moon illusion. The reason why the moon looks larger on the horizon is because it looks like it's further away than the same moon up in the night sky. You can see this on any good full moon night. When that moon's on the horizon, it looks a lot bigger than it will look later on in the night sky. That's because the moon on the horizon looks like it's further away. The moon up in the night sky looks like it's actually closer than it really is. So we underestimate how far away it is from us. The one on the horizon, we overestimate how far away it is from us. And so we perceive it as being bigger than it actually is. So the moon on the horizon is not actually bigger. It's not actually closer. It's not actually further away. It just looks like it's further away. That's the reason why we perceive it as being bigger. Now the Mueller-Lyer illusion is similar here. The Mueller-Lyer illusion is when you take this vertical line and put these tails on it either this way or that way. All of a sudden that same line, that's the same length, looks like it's longer here than here. Some people say it's because the tails here focus your attention outward, therefore causing this line to look longer than that line. But the explanation for the Mueller-Lyer illusion that's most accepted by psychologists is basically the same as the explanation for the moon illusion. And let me back up a little bit. It's been shown that if you go to very primitive tribes in Africa and show them these same lines, what you find is they're not fooled by it. They don't think that this line is longer than that one. It's really only people who live in the Western kind of modernized carpentered world that we live in. And perhaps what's going on here, as the explanation goes, when you live in a carpentered world, you're likely to see this kind of corner in your environment often in the form of outside corners. And this line with these tails is often seen in our world as an inside corner. And inside corners in our world are most often going to be further away from us than outside corners. And so our experience leads us to believe that this is further away than that. And so therefore, this has to be longer. Now, again, what this suggests is something called perceptual sets. Perceptual sets are expectations or ways of thinking based on our environmental experiences and our past. We all have perceptual sets that are based on the world that we have lived in that cause us to perceive things a certain way. And if you have this kind of perceptual set, it may lead you to willfully, actively, subjectively perceive something quite a bit differently than somebody else might, whose perceptual sets are different. I would argue that perceptual sets are hugely important in biases and prejudice and stereotypes, and also all the positive side of all that stuff. And it's a huge part of education. My job as an educator is to give you new perceptual sets, ways of perceiving things so that you can perceive the world in different ways than you used to. I used to think my job was to give you tons of information. I don't think that so much anymore. My job is to make you think, and also in relationship to making you think, giving you new ways of looking at the world. This is the difference between what's called bottom-up and top-down processing, bottom-up and top-down perception. So bottom-up perception is when you're presented with something for the very first time. And in order to make sense of it, you have to just sort of build up a base of information from scratch in order to perceive it accurately. You're working from the bottom up, and it tends to be a little more frustrating, sometimes can lead to more inaccurate perceptions initially because you don't have a whole fund of information to draw upon. Top-down processing or top-down perception is what happens when you have a whole fund of information and a whole set of experiences that causes you to perceive something a certain way. And if it's something familiar to you, you perceive it a lot more readily and perhaps accurately because of that, all that information that you have. So having a whole bunch of perceptual sets to help you to perceive something is like being a top-down processor. Not having any perceptual sets at all is like being a bottom-up processor. When you look at this, again, hard to see on the screen, you're a bottom-up processor because you have no really information to help you to perceive this. There's not a whole lot of cues here to help you determine what it is. But if somebody says, that's an N, that looks like a big block letter N, then when you look at it, again, with that information, you see a big column on the left side, kind of a cross column this way, and one on the right side. And you can see, oh yeah, that's an N, I see that. And if you're able to see it now, then it's because you're a top-down processor. The reason why you couldn't see it, perceive it accurately initially, is because you were a bottom-up processor. And so again, my job as a teacher, I think, is to make you a top-down processor when it comes to certain elements of psychology that I'm trying to teach you. Now I want to show you something else that I found recently that's kind of interesting. Take a look at these two tables here. This table looks to be longer, and the top being a rectangle that seems to be longer than wide, and this one seems to be more of a square, right? But it's an illusion. So if you take that, this is green, two tops are green. If you take that green top and make it blue, and then take that green top and move it over here and change direction and put it down on that one, it's the same. So this is an illusion. illusion that's based on the expectation, the way these legs are and the orientation here, that orientation causes us to think that this is a rectangle and this is more of a square. But it's all an optical illusion, as you can see when you move the top. Again, what's happening here is your brain, your expectation causes you to perceive something a certain way that's just not accurate, just not true. So anyway, that's the end of the chapter. I just want to emphasize that perception is reality. It's not really reality, but it's the only thing that really matters. And it's the thing that can cause us to live in a very false world because of the perceptual sets that we have. And we need to be careful, and we need to constantly be striving to give ourselves more information, more exposure to different ways of thinking so that we have a better ability to perceive perception accurately. Anyway, I hope you had fun with this chapter, and I think it could have been a lot better if we were face to face, but we just have to manage in this way. I'll see you next time.